Hey class. So last time we talked about ACT utilitarianism, founder Jeremy Bentham. Today we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill. He was actually Jeremy Bentham's godson. He was also a utilitarian, but he saw some problems with ACT utilitarianism and came up with a different formulation. We now refer to it as rule utilitarianism. So I'll be asking you in some ways the differences, and I want you to be able to articulate that. So Jeremy Bentham came up with ACT, John Stuart Mill, rule. He made 3 changes, John Stuart Mill did, to his godfather's moral theory. 1, he eliminates the hedonistic calculus. We didn't talk about this much, but it is in the reading. Bentham had a whole calculus for how to decide whether something was moral or immoral. When you talk about what kind of happiness an action brought, he would ask certain questions. What's its purity? That is, it brings you happiness now, but what are the chances that it'll bring you pain later? And then you would score it on a scale of like 1 to 10 or -1 to -10, right, for positive or negative. So I eat a piece of chocolate cake, it makes me happy. If I eat a second piece of chocolate cake, it'll make me happy, but there's a good chance that's going to be followed by stomach pain, potentially obesity and diabetes or whatever. So the purity of that act is not high. The intensity of the act, right? How intensely will it make me happy or sad? Where death would receive the highest level of negative intensity, right? And winning the Nobel Prize might give you the highest intensity of positive happiness or something. So he asked these questions, and he had this whole calculus mapped up almost like a pro-con list for consequences. But in the end, John Stuart Mill argued, these are arbitrary. The numbers that you assign to something and the numbers that I assign to something will be very different. So it's not an objective criteria or standard. It seems really random. So he shifts it to make it more common sense based. We're not going to assign numbers to things. We're going to look and say, what's likely to happen if I do this? Who's likely to be affected? How likely are they to be affected in these ways? And then we act on our best information and our common sense, right? John Stuart Mill also says we need to get clearer about happiness. So he creates this idea of higher and lower pleasures. He calls higher level pleasures like spiritual pleasures, lower level physical pleasures. That's important. So sex, food, football, entertainment. These are physical pleasures, pleasures of the body. Those are not what we're trying to maximize with the principle of utility. Higher pleasures or spiritual pleasures are things like watching my son graduate from high school or having fulfilling work or a strong marriage, a sense of peace internally, financially, and other things. These are the kinds of things we're looking for. Good character, honesty, the kind of happiness that comes from that, right? Those are the kinds of happiness, that's the kind of happiness we're trying to maximize. So we're not going to, kill one person to give 100 people free cable, because we're not interested in lower level pleasures like that. We're interested in the higher level pleasures. Think of happiness like human flourishing, real well-being. What will help us really live fully into being human and our deep desires like health, relationships, stability, peace, and happiness. So think of it that way. And John Stuart Mill says that's really what we're trying to maximize here. And then third, he replaces ACT utilitarianism with rule utilitarianism. And we'll talk about that now. Rule utilitarianism says this: before making a moral decision, one must ask oneself, can I make this action a rule for everyone in similar circumstances to follow? Would this rule maximize happiness and minimize happiness for the most people possible? This is different from ACT utilitarianism, because in ACT utilitarianism, we only hold individual actions up to the principle of utility. When we use rule utilitarianism, however, we make a rule and see if the rule follows the principle of utility, right? And this is important. And so I think this is going to be made most clear when we look at examples. A few things though. Rule utilitarianism takes the long view of consequences. What will this do long term? Act utilitarianism often looks at the immediate. What will happen right now in my situation? Rule utilitarianism is very similar to act utilitarianism. Both focus solely on consequences. Both are hard universalist theories. Both are hedonistic. Both argue that happiness is the only intrinsic value. The difference is one focuses on individual actions, the other focuses on rules. So let's look at some of the examples we looked at before. This situation with the innocent fat man stuck in the cave, they can't get out. Do I blow this person up and let 9 escape? I think a rule utilitarian is going to say, what if we made this a rule for everyone in similar circumstances to follow? If we will that everyone kill 1 to save 9, would that rule maximize happiness overall, right? And the answer, I think, is yes. The rule utilitarian says, anytime your choice is kill 1 or kill 9, you always kill the 1, right? That can be a rule. But let's look at the magistrate. In this case, in the specific action, if I kill the innocent person and appease the mob, 1 person dies rather than a bunch of people in the town burning. In this individual situation, the best thing to do is to kill the innocent person. But the rule utilitarian says, if I make this a rule that the magistrate always appease the mob, always appease the loudest voice when they threaten, would that maximize happiness overall? Good consequences for the most? And the rule utilitarian would say, no. If you give in to the crowd now, they're just going to demand for other things. And then you're going to have to give in and give in. They know that anytime they threaten you with violence, you'll give them what they want. No, they say, it's better to create a rule that the magistrate do the just thing, stand up to the mob, because that will make it less likely for the mob in the future to continue to resist, right? Long term, this is a better society. And that's what the rule utilitarian cares. We want to set up rules for our society that tend, over time, to maximize good consequences for the most. We don't want to focus on the short term, sacrificing the long term. You can see this with the economic crisis in some ways, right? The foreclosure situation. Banks, over time, decided it was not worth their time and trouble when someone foreclosed, right? When someone stopped making payments. The bank said, it's a hassle to hire lawyers, go to court, try to seize assets. To do all these things costs us so much more money. So we'll just let people walk away from their house. We're not going to pursue them. Their credit will get dinged for a time, and we'll just move on, resell the house, recuperate some of our losses, and that will actually help us financially, right? And in the short term, that's true. Taking this 1 person or these 2 or 3 people all the way to court to seize assets during a foreclosure is not in the bank's best interest. But the rule utilitarian says, yes, but look what you set up. You made it so easy for people to be foreclosed upon, you didn't go after them, that everyone started doing it, and suddenly it wasn't in the bank's best interest. As a rule, it would have been better to punish those people as harshly as you could, detour other people from being defaulted on their loans, and you would have avoided or potentially avoided the crisis. You focused on the short-term consequences and what would be most beneficial, not long-term. And the rule utilitarian says, if we made this a rule to follow continually or consistently, would that still maximize good consequences? To the example of, should the person tell their date that the dress looks flattering on them or not, right? An act utilitarian says, in this situation, lie, you'll both be happier for it. But a rule utilitarian would probably say, well, if you made lying about little things a rule to follow, would that make for good relationships overall? Would that help you more overall? The idea is no. It seems like you would undercut the very relationship you're trying to nurture by creating a foundation of instability. Can she really trust anything that this person says later? If she finds out he lies about this he tells her what she wants to hear when it might be uncomfortable? Is that any way to build a relationship? And the rule utilitarian says, if you follow that rule, none of your relationships will work out long term. You're too focused on the short term, not the long term. So the rule utilitarian still cares about consequences, but it's more about what kinds of principles will help us maximize utility, not looking at just isolated situations. This has to make sense to you. If it doesn't, please email me or let me know, right? Because I'm going to continually ask for things like, well, analyze this situation from an act utilitarian standpoint. Okay, well now analyze it from a rule utilitarian standpoint. And I'm going to want you to know the difference between the two. Okay, so now that we've talked about these two, I want to talk about potential objections to utilitarianism. One objection is that the future is always uncertain. Anytime you base a moral theory on consequences, you run into a problem, because I don't know what my action is going to do. I hope this is what my action does. I hope it helps more than it hurts, but I don't know for sure because the future is unpredictable. And so how do I know, right? This was put in clear perspective to me. I remember reading an article about the Iraq War, and this was a few years ago, and they said, we won't know whether the Iraq War was moral or immoral for another 10 or 20 years, because if, in fact, there's a stable democracy in Iraq in 10 or 20 years, then it was the moral thing to do because it benefited the most people overall. But if Iraq falls back into civil war and another military dictator takes its place, then the Iraq War would have been unjust or immoral. And I thought, don't you have to know whether the war is moral before you get into it? Are you telling me that you don't know whether it was the moral thing to do for another decade or two? That's problematic morally. It seems like if you're going to spend a bunch of money and kill a bunch of people, you would have to know it was for a moral cause. But if you're a utilitarian, it's moral only if the consequences end up beneficial for the whole. And that's really uncertain in a lot of situations. If I lie to my date and tell her she looks great when she doesn't, what if we go out and she gets embarrassed? And she's like, why didn't you tell me? And it backfires. I don't know what my action is going to cause. I can only hope it causes the outcomes I'm looking for, but that creates a problem for the utilitarian. Are consequences all that really matter, right? Do we want to incorporate moral principles, moral rules or universals that might help us, like don't steal, don't lie, other things, or are we really only going to care about consequences? Do intentions matter? That I intended to follow the principle of utility, right? My neighbors were out of town. I thought it would be a good idea to turn their heater on when they came back so that their house was nice and warm rather than cold. And a fire started and the house burned down. Is it really immoral, even though my intention was to do something nice for my neighbor, right? It seems like morally we might want to consider more. There's also a problem of sheer numbers. Individual rights can slip away. If the government decides that it will be better for society, safer for society, for them to take away your right to privacy, tap your phone lines, check your homes without a warrant, right? Let's assume this is for homeland security. We want to weed out terrorism. Well, all of a sudden, my individual rights go away because it's deemed that society will be safer, that consequences will be maximized if we take certain rights away. We might argue that slavery, it hurts. Let's say we want to say, let's enslave 5% of the population. We get free labor. It's going to benefit the economy and help us with 95%. 95% of people will be better off. 5% will be hurt. Isn't that a problem, though, with the people's rights that are being violated? Or if we tax the top 2%, 98% of the country will benefit. But some might say you're violating the rights of the 2% by taking their property through taxation. So there can be some problems with a utilitarian mindset, and it's something we might want to consider. All right, well, I hope this has helped. I've just given you like a rough sketch of utilitarianism. I'm going to ask you to apply it to various situations. If you have any questions at all, if I can help in any way, please let me know. I'll talk to you later.